Hello, and welcome to the Argyle CFO Summit. My name is Brittany Sullivan with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. I have some important information to share with you, and then we will turn the floor over to our esteemed opening keynote speaker. First, we would like to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Oversight. Our sponsor is committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. At any time during today's event, you can visit their virtual booth from the main agenda page, which includes complimentary materials, information, and meet and greet opportunities. We also welcome you to stay socially connected during today's event. For those of you who are active tweeters, please use the hashtag ArgyleDigital and follow us on Twitter at Argyle Exec Forum. Also be sure to follow Argyle on LinkedIn for special announcements. I would like to also take a moment to touch on our content neutrality policy, which we have curated based on the feedback we've received over the years from our members. We have worked closely with our speaking faculty to ensure that you receive a set of balanced and neutral viewpoints during the session today, and we truly appreciate our members' support of this policy. Finally, and most importantly, we would love to hear from you. So during each session, we encourage you to submit your questions and comments in the Q&A box on your screen. Following each presentation, we have set aside time for our speakers to weigh in on your questions. Thank you again for joining us. Now let's get started. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Matt Pileski, Regional Chief Financial Officer at Arthur J. Gallagher. We are excited to have Matt with us for his opening keynote titled Future of Finance, Persuading Through Storytelling and Financial Data. Welcome, Matt, and over to you.
Okay. Well, I'm very honored to be here today, kind of talking about how we use financial data to tell a story and influence, and also kind of talk about some of the impact it has versus some trends that are coming, like AI coming in. So my agenda today is really to go through, well, what's this artificial intelligence impact? Can data tell a story? Look at standardized reports versus the effectiveness of stories, some persuasive storytelling, some takeaways, tell you a little bit about myself here. I started my career about 20 years ago at KPMG. I specialized in publicly traded firms with stock prices less than $1, learned a lot, went through some restatement audits, going concerns opinions, learned a lot there. But since 2006, I've been at Arthur Gallagher. And really my story there is that I've been helping Gallagher scale, really. And what do we mean by scale? That means that we look at our revenue growth. We want our revenue growth to be higher than our cost growth. And if we do that, we get margin improvement, we create economies of scale. So really looking, everything that I do is how we fill that story of how do we scale the business? How do we find those things we're better at? How do we really grow our business by scaling it? So as we go in here and we look at artificial intelligence impact, and this was a report that came out just in March of 2023, that we could have 300 million jobs replaced. That's 1/5 of the whole employment in the world, with particular hits of jobs that were considered automation proof in the past, such as legal and finance. So some questions that we would ask: one, does that mean our jobs are at risk? And two, probably more importantly, how do we use AI to make us better? So as we go through this, really take a step back and say, what are really my goals as a CFO? And I think we have two sets of goals here. Some are compliance task oriented, such as I have to do an annual budget. I have to do forecasting, I have to do financial reporting, have to do expense controls. And I think all of these compliance tasks, these are things that are ripe for automation. And honestly, I would be thankful the less of the compliance tasks, mundane things, the less I have to do with that, the better. Because where do I like to spend my time? It's on the value oriented. It's strategically advising. It's getting resource allocations right so we can grow the business. It's getting my capital structure right so we put things. It's the estimates and assumptions that I make. It's partnering with the business to say, how do we outperform? And the reality is, what I love about finance is we have all the data. So I can go through and we can know the numbers better than anybody. And when you can tell the business something that they didn't know that you found in the data that helps them run it better, that's really fun. And that's never going to be really easy to automate. So recent phenomenon here is ChatGPT, and you hear a lot about this. So I went online and asked it. I'm like, this was inspired by one of my colleagues who didn't understand. She's like, I presented the data to my business unit and they just didn't understand it. So I go, can data speak for itself? And the obvious answer is no. And the good news is ChatGPT agreed with us. They came through, this was their actual response, but highlighting the part that I have in blue at the bottom, AI even knows it requires human judgment, critical thinking, and an understanding of the broader context in which the data is situated. While data can provide valuable insights and evidence to support or challenge certain claims or arguments, it cannot fully replace human analysis. So it's a complementary good. It's not a replacement. And I think there's even been some studies that I've seen out there, or actually some actual real world examples, where they've eliminated jobs, replaced it with ChatGPT, and then they're finding ChatGPT makes mistakes and gets them in trouble because it's not a replacement, it's a complementary tool. At this point, we'll see where it evolves to. So again, saying, hey, I really like having all the numbers. And here's an example of why data cannot speak for itself. As you look at this is Simpson's paradox, and that's a phenomenon where data really contradicts itself. So look at this. This is an example where if you look at the total, if you're looking at averages, in total, 23% of women were accepted to a college as opposed to 24%. You're thinking, man, that's not fair. We're putting in more men, and you can argue whether 1% is statistically significant or not. But the point is, look, and then in every category, the mix of what you applied to is important. So you look at this, in every category, the women had higher rates than the men, but in total, the men had a higher rate. And that's confusing. And this is what our job in finances is to interpret this data and present it in a way that makes sense to our end users. Because I would never show this, say, hey, look how complicated my job is. I have to interpret this. I would go through, analyze this, and figure out, well, what is the story that I want to tell my end user? What are the conclusions we want to draw from it? And it's our job to really understand these things, not present, oh, here's the difficulty there is in me having to analyze all this data. No, I would put it into a form of a short story where it really could be more influential to the end users. I think another example, as we talked about, where can data speak for itself? When I first started doing strategic plans, I ran a model for my business units. And I had two different business units that had similar numbers. So I ran the exact same model over that. When I ran the exact same model, when we went and pitched it, the people we're pitching it to, one group, they said, these are terrible numbers. And the other one said they were great numbers. And what I couldn't understand is like, well, they're the same numbers. And so I think where they're starting from, the context is more important sometimes than what the actual data says. So you really need to spend a lot of time crafting your story. So back to ChatGPT, where I asked ChatGPT to help me explain Simpson's paradox. So I just asked it, can you give me an example? And it went through and it gave me an example. And it said, Department A, 80 out of 100 men. Department B, 120 out of 200. I'm like, okay, this is good. Like this, it looked really great when I looked at it. And then I looked at the bottom and I'm like, wait, am I missing something? Why is it telling me 140 out of 300? Doesn't make any sense. So I asked it, and I got a really polite apology here. It said, apologies for the error in previous response, which I started laughing. You are correct. The numbers provided were incorrect. Here's the correct example. And then I'm looking at this and I'm analyzing it with my critical thinking hat. And I'm like, wait a minute, this is not an example of Simpson's paradox, because in all instances, the men are higher than the women. 80 is greater than 70, 60 is greater than 50, 70 is greater than 60. So while this tool is, it's in beta mode, it's coming, it's going to be great, it's not quite there yet. Okay. So then another example of AI versus humans, in 2019, there was, many of you heard of this, there was a debate between a skilled debater. He won like 36 international competitions. His name was Harish, and IBM's Deborah Joe AI program. And I think there's some really important takeaways from this, because the question was, should we subsidize kindergarten? And AI had said, yes, that was their position. And the human position was, no, we shouldn't. So as you look at how things changed, the human had a 17% increase in where they were. But I think what's most important is realize people came into the debate with a pre-existing notions. And you're not going to change everybody when you present data. You're going to nudge them into the right direction, and we're trying to influence. We're not going to be able to give them one set of data and completely change their opinions. So as you look at this, pre-debate, 79 were yes, 13 were no. That changed to 62 and 30. So we didn't change everybody. And then the other thing is here is when you're actually looking to influence people, the way that AI goes at it is they try to win every battle. They treat it like a war. So for every point, there's a counterpoint, and they're trying to just flood you with information, and they really don't put it in context. Whereas a skilled debater will actually look and have a theme and actually give on some points to really build credibility and confidence. So it's really more a right brain activity than a left brain activity. So you have to know your numbers, but it's more than just providing them. It's providing them in an organized way that's meant to influence people. And it's not really meant to always give them the answer. It's meant to give context, influence, build empathy, and that takes time in relationship building. Okay. So there's also been a trend here of, I've heard this many times, we want to develop a standardized report so we can do the same report in the company, everybody gets the same thing, and then when we measure, it's all the same, make everything the same. And there's a lot of good to this. It's consistent, it's repeatable and audible, it's scalable. There's a little bit of comfort in seeing the same thing all the time. You know, there's probably less errors when you do it all the same thing. But then there's the bad. It's boring. Let's say, like, how many standard reports were really helpful when COVID hit? Did that really help us? We had to go dig in, find other things. The data can be ambiguous. There's a lot of confirmation bias. So when the end user is looking at it, they're not really looking at it to see things that work against what they're trying to do. They usually use it just to support their previous positions. It's hard to focus on issues and trends that change over time because you're always showing the same thing. So I always try to present the monthly results with some type of story that shows where things are trending, what type of action, if any, we're trying to aspire. Say if nothing changed, maybe you don't really need to know anything. We don't change our strategy every month. But thinking about, okay, how do I present things more in a story format than just here's your set of numbers? Okay. Is storytelling easy? And no, it's not. This is a great quote from Ed Catmull, who's the CEO of Disney Pixar, because early on, all our movies suck. That's a blunt assessment, I know, but I make a point of repeating it often. And I choose that phrasing because saying it in a softer way fails to convey how bad the first versions of our films really are. So I practice over and over getting our story right. And I think sometimes we also say it's like a chief repeating officer. You got to say it over and over again because people don't get you're not persuasive the first time you say it. And people need to hear it multiple times. So I think if we spend as much time figuring out what the conclusions from our data is just, okay, let's close the books, let's get the data, let somebody else interpret them, we really can be more influential. Okay. I think it's also important to look at the science of the story, and there's really, you got to know all 5 parts, which are setting, point of view, characters, conflict, and plot. So as we go through this, the setting is the time and place of the story. So from a financial story, do your homework, know where you are in the business cycle. Are you in the growth, startup phase, growth phase, maturity? Where are you in the cycle? Because that's very important to the context. What are the trends? Look at interest rates right now. They're going way up. There's a war in Ukraine that may impact you, it may not. but things are always changing. Inflationary times, you got to know where you are relative to what's going on in the market. What's your own competitive advantage? Where do you outperform? Do your SWOT analysis. Are you outperforming or underperforming? And we have a little tip here too. It's like, I always like to encourage the growth mindset. So I'm in insurance brokerage, which is a very mature industry, but we always like to say, hey, we're just getting started. We want to position it like we're in that growth phase to encourage that growth mindset, because if we don't have that growth mindset, we're going to struggle to make that next leap and really transforming where we want to get to. The characters and point of view in your story. Now, it's important to know that there's multiple stories. The protagonist is always your hero. Antagonist is your villain. Then the love interest is what that protagonist is, who they're going after, whether it's a person or a thing. Confidant or guide, that's the role that I think we always want to be in. We do not want to be the protagonist of our story. The story can't be about how accounting and finance created these numbers, because that's not the business we're in unless you're in an accounting and finance firm. The story needs to be about what we're doing for our customers, what we're doing for the other employees. Those are the protagonists, not us. We're trying to guide them. Then you also need to know the deuter antagonists. These are supporting cast members who are protagonists in a side story. If you think back to like the sitcom Cheers, first there was Cheers, then there was Frasier. Frasier was a spinoff. He was a deuter antagonist in the Cheers episode, but then he becomes and gets his own spinoff. So you can see this similar with like other departments. It's like, well, the individual business unit might be the protagonist of their story, but they're really a supporting actor in the whole company's story. Then you have your other characters, you have your foil that might be your competitor that's not really the villain, but you know, they're competing against the protagonist. I think the takeaways here from the point of view, we definitely want to be this confidant or guide. Know that everybody has their own story. And if you give the same set of numbers to different protagonists, they're going to interpret it differently. So you got to think like, how do we say the numbers from that person's point of view? Some people might like it in a ratio format. Some people might need it in a hard dollar format. Like, how do we connect with people? How do we inspire action? And realize there's always noise. We want to eliminate the noise from our story, because when you confuse, you lose. In getting your message succinct, you've got to eliminate the noise. Conflict and plot here. Conflict in a story is a struggle between two forces. Plot is like the series of events. I think what's funny what happens here is with finance, the conflict is always about money. And it always comes to me like, how should we spend it? And I try to redirect that to, we are investing money. We are trying to invest money to get a return. So, and then you got to go and get the whole background, get the plot right to say, well, what really needs to happen so I can tell this story, so I can actually generate a return on capital. This goes back to, how do we scale the business? Are we doing things? Because when you look at the one individual without the broader context, you might not come to the right decision. And a lot of times things are pitched without all those relevant details. Okay. The 7 types of story here. I think the key here is to know that, hey, there are stories that get told over and over again, whether it's the David and Goliath, Little Orphan Annie, Star Wars, Goldilocks. Borrow from these stories. And then, as you know, Donald Miller, who does StoryBrand, would say, there's really 7 parts to every story. There's a character. That character encounters a problem. Then to solve that problem, they need a guide. That's where we want to be the guide. The guide inspires them to action. And then with that action, they're going to learn something. They're going to get a result. Either it's going to go good or it's going to go bad. And whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. The continuous learning here and trying things and learning from our mistakes and the journey of learning, that's really what we're aspiring to. And us, with all the data, we're there to measure it. We're there to inspire. We're there to make them think. And this is something only a human can do. Can't really just be done by a machine. Okay. One of the stories that I like to use is this tragedy. Winter is coming. I mean, CFOs, where we like to give good news all the time, we really need to make sure people are prepared for the bad news. Pessimism is going to inspire people, and we need to make sure that we get them to, like, if it's in the summer, like a little tree over here, it's 75 degrees and sunny. Well, nobody wants to like quit vacation. Everybody likes the summer, but the winter does come. And if we don't prepare for it, then, you know, we'll be that squirrel who got fed and doesn't store any food for the winter, and then you starve. So use tragedies to make sure, use the tragedy story to make sure that we prepare, that we set aside our rainy day funds. Phase transitions is another one I like to use, rebirth, because companies are always trying to transform themselves. And you think, you know, in transformations, we don't always lay out in story format what that actually means to the people who are doing the transformation. And they'll say like, oh, I tried that, it didn't work. Well, the reality is, let's say you have a block of ice that's at 23 degrees. And you do a lot of stuff to raise the temperature, and it goes to 28 degrees. Well, nothing happened. Nothing, so it's like, and all of a sudden you hit this magic number 32, and that ice, it shifts to water. Then you go, and nothing's gonna happen to that water until you get all the way up to 212. Does that mean nothing's happening between those points? No, there's a lot happening. So we gotta do all these actions, but you only get those tipping points at certain points where you get these phase transitions. Okay? The simple model, the forest versus the trees. This is another one, because I'm always trying to inspire that business model. And hey, if we follow the business model, it's going to work, because I'm in an industry where we have a proven model. And it's like, so in the 1950s, a scientist came up with, well, we really realized the density of a forest, the number of trees in forest, that'll tell you when we hit certain temperatures, when we hit certain things, how fast forest fires are going to spread. And they gave that information to the forest rangers, and they rejected it in the 1950s. And because they're like, well, you don't understand that all the trees are different. They grow at different slopes. There's different humidity levels. Your model is too simple. It's not usable. Well, then in 1988, there was a massive fire. The winter came in Yellowstone Park, and all of a sudden they figured out, maybe if we would have just controlled the density of the forest, if we would have used the macro model, this wouldn't have happened. And then they actually created something that was simple enough for the forest fires to buy into it. They said, hey, we took into effect the slope of the trees, the wind. They made their model simple enough to be applied at the macro, but meaningful enough to be applied at the micro. And we'll see this within companies all the time, because I have my divisional data, which is the macro, then I have my local. If we choose the same procedures on both, the local, usually the changes in estimates aren't there. And I think the other thing too is making sure, hey, as you're really looking at this, we want to understand the model, and we want to understand variances from the model, not noise that comes from variances from prior year plan that really isn't germane to our story. Spend a lot of time like normalizing stuff to say, hey, this was a one-time event. And then there's also, when we're having a meeting, they want the real-time data. Well, all I'm going to do is give you the real-time data and then spend time filtering out the noise to go back to the story that you wanted. Spend more time on the story. And sometimes last month's data, it's just as relevant as this month's data in inspiring action. Okay. I think we'll try to wrap up here pretty quickly, but examples here, companies that failed to innovate. These are examples of winter is coming. They didn't prepare for it. They missed it. The other one that I really like here is the protagonist buyers formula. So you look at this, when we're trying to inspire change here, introduce an idea, establishing yourself as an expert. You got all the numbers, you understand them, and then when the problem comes up, you're positioning yourself as a guide. I deal with this kind of thing all the time. Let me see if I can help you. Then you can say, you can outline the obvious ways it's going to fail. If we lose business, it's going to be bad. If we get new business, but then there's some counterintuitive things, some nuances that you can come up with the data that you can recognize, that you can list the obvious actions. Go get new customers. Well, then you go to the less obvious hacks, which are like, look, here's some nuances that you can see in the data that I would do, but always hand over autonomy. So that's what I would do, but I'm not your boss. You can do whatever you want with this information. Make sure you're redirecting to establish boundings. People always worry about the 30 things, but there's really only 5 that matter, and let's boil it down to those 5. So I think that's a useful formula for crafting your story. So key takeaways here: know your protagonist and position yourself as a guide. Know the context and story setting by being up to date on data trends, as well as you need those conversations from the business. Relying on data without those conversations, you're not going to get the context right. People take action with pessimism. Use that winter is coming script, give the bad news with the good news, but then also list kind of the upside actions. Use the story templates and eliminate unnecessary noise from your stories while keeping both supporting. You got to tell both sides of the story, don't just tell one side. Finally, I have in here some appendix that will pass out, I think, this, where like, here's some statistics and stories, here's some tips to putting those in, and then I'll open it up for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matt, for such an insightful presentation. We could go ahead and address a couple of the questions that came through. This first question: are employees open about addressing their concerns regarding AI taking away their jobs?
I have not got a lot of questions from my team about it. So if they have those concerns, they're not sharing it with me. But I think what we want to do here is I have been kind of introducing some of these tools and saying, how do we use these to make our lives better? And I think a lot of the insights obviously come from me not telling my team what to do. But if I make these options available to them, they usually will tell me how to use it before I even figure it out myself.
Perfect. Thank you. This next question: what is the best way to help finance teams, or maybe your finance team, understand how storytelling relates to the finance function?
I think by example, usually, because I think what happens a lot of time is there is some astonishment when you give the numbers. We spend so much time preparing the numbers, this realization that the data is not going to speak for itself. And so I think just walking through examples where we wanted to be persuasive and they didn't see the same thing we didn't see because we didn't put it in that context.
Great, thank you. It looks like we have a couple other questions that we have time for. In regards to automation and AI or digital transformation, what processes are most important to automate first?
I think it's going to depend on the business, but I think those things that are the most frequent, that are repeatable in nature. For example, if you want to calculate the same number every month, well, then automate it. It could be just your growth rate, or it could be like, look, get your stuff in a database where it's data accessible. I mean, a lot of things we have problems is like when you have data in multiple databases, well, then it can't talk to each other and you can't do it. So getting one platform is probably the best recommendation.
Perfect, thank you. And can you predict what the next big thing will be after AI?
Well, I think AI will just continue to be an evolution. I mean, you think about it, like 4 years ago, driverless cars was a huge thing, and they were told that I haven't seen many driverless cars yet, and maybe what you'll see is more the evolution that we'll be sitting at the car, and you'll have more options with cruise control. Don't really see there are no drivers in cars coming anytime soon. So I think things will be more of an evolution than it is just predicting what the next big thing is.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Matt. That is all the time we have for audience Q&A, but thank you again for such an excellent keynote. I also want to thank everyone else who joined us today. This session, along with all of today's content, will be made available on demand following the event. Thank you again, Matt.
Thank you.